Chapter 1. Too much to love. He said I was too much to love, that I made everything bigger than it needed to be. But the night he left, I realized peace without truth is just silence. I was a therapist who taught others to find their voice, yet somehow lost mine inside his calm. Until one day I hit record. What began as a whisper became the Storm Diaries, and the world finally heard what my silence had been trying to say. The recording light on my office microphone blinked red before fading to black. Another session over. I closed my notebook, trying to steady my breathing. Maya had just left, her voice still echoing in my head. She was 25, thoughtful, fragile, and spent the entire hour describing how her boyfriend told her she was too emotional, too intense, too much. I'd reassured her, told her that sensitivity wasn't a flaw, that it was connection, awareness, empathy. But when the door clicked shut, my own pulse betrayed me. Every word I'd said to comfort her felt like it belonged to someone braver than me. The Seattle sky outside my window was soft gray, the kind that blurred the skyline into watercolor. I stared at my reflection in the glass hair, pinned neatly, blouse buttoned to the collar, the image of composure. Beneath it, a quiet throb of truth. I'd heard those same words before. Too emotional, too much, too complicated. 4 years earlier at a psychology conference in Los Angeles, I'd met Ethan Cole. He was 36, then co-founder of a financial firm, charming, in that restrained corporate way that made everyone lean closer. I was giving a talk on trauma-informed therapy. Afterward, he approached me, complimented my clarity, said he admired how I could turn chaos into understanding. His attention felt warm and clean. For someone who spent her life listening to others being truly heard, was intoxicating. We started long-distance calling, every night, his voice low and deliberate. When he finally convinced me to move back north to Seattle, it felt like a decision rooted in trust. He rented an apartment overlooking Lake Union, all glass and symmetry, and told me we'd fill it with calm. The first year was easy. He'd bring coffee to my desk while I charted patient notes, and he'd listen as I recounted stories of people finding themselves again. He called me his storm of insight, said he loved my mind. The cracks came quietly. At first it was small comments. You analyze everything. Can't you just relax? When I shared a story about a client who reminded me of my mother, he said I was getting too attached. He began correcting my tone during arguments, calling me intense. Once after a long day, he sighed and said, "You make everything bigger than it needs to be." I apologized. I always apologized. Somewhere along the way, I stopped finishing sentences. I started editing myself before words even reached my lips. Silence became safer than honesty. If I felt hurt, I told myself I was overreacting. If I felt joy, I kept it quiet so it wouldn't look dramatic. He wanted calm. I wanted connection. Those two things kept colliding until I no longer recognized which one belonged to me. By 2021, I was 33, and our relationship had shrunk into routines polished to emptiness. Friday dinners, muted conversations, the illusion of partnership. That evening we sat in our favorite restaurant downtown. The place was all flickering candles and jazz murmuring in the background. I'd been preoccupied all week with a patient who'd relapsed into self-blame after years of progress. When I brought it up, hoping for empathy, Ethan barely looked up from his phone. "You have to stop carrying everyone's problems," he said. "It's my job," I answered quietly. "You take it home with you. It's exhausting." He said it like a statement of fact, not cruelty, but it landed with precision. I tried to smile, to redirect. I told him I'd been considering writing about emotional exhaustion, maybe turning my research into a podcast. He set the phone down and looked at me, calm and measured. "Liana, you're too much to love. You always have been. I need peace, not intensity." For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. My breath caught on the edges of those words. Too much to love. They sounded rehearsed, like he'd tried them on in his head before saying them out loud. I forced a small laugh, pretending it didn't sting, pretending I was the composed woman he wanted me to be. "Peace," I said, "isn't the absence of feeling." He shrugged, signaled the waiter, and asked for the check. The rest of dinner dissolved into polite remarks about traffic and weather, like strangers killing time at an airport bar. When we got back to the apartment, he grabbed his overnight bag, said he needed space, that we were different kinds of people. I didn't stop him. The door closed softly, almost tenderly, as if he were leaving a library instead of a life. For hours, I sat on the couch staring at the reflection of city lights across the lake. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment I'd started believing that peace meant being quiet. I opened my laptop out of habit. On the screen were clinical notes from sessions I'd written over the years. Words from patients describing confusion after being told they were too emotional, too sensitive, too needy. Phrases I'd highlighted once for research now pulsed on the screen like confessions. I could have copied them directly from my own journal. I scrolled to a section titled Gaslighting Patterns in Emotional Relationships. The examples blurred together: dismissal, minimization, reversal. I read the lines again and again until my eyes burned. He'd used all of them softly, almost kindly. You're imagining things. You always make me the bad guy. You're too emotional to think clearly. I remembered every time I'd doubted my perception because he sounded reasonable. Every time I'd apologized for wanting to be understood. I had built a career helping people reclaim their voices, yet I'd let mine erode under the weight of someone else's composure. The clock on my desk glowed 2:14 a.m. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hands trembled too much to drink. I grabbed the notebook I used for therapy reflections and turned to a blank page. He wanted calm. But peace without truth is just silence. The ink bled slightly into the paper, steady, deliberate. I stared at the sentence until my heartbeat slowed. Somewhere outside, a ferry horn sounded across the lake, long and low, a sound that usually meant departure. Tonight, it felt like permission. I closed the notebook, shut off the light, and let the quiet settle, not his quiet, but mine. If this story touched you, please subscribe, and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 2. The Hollow Quiet. Morning came slow and colorless. The apartment felt like a museum of someone else's life. His jacket still hung by the door, his coffee mug sat upside down in the rack, the faint scent of his cologne hiding in the curtains. No yelling, no slammed doors, no chaos, just the kind of quiet people envy until they have to live inside it. I made coffee out of habit and poured it into the same cup I'd used every morning for years. The steam rose and disappeared before I could take a sip. Outside, the city was frozen in that gray light. Seattle does so well where everything looks damp and tired. I tried working through my client notes, but the words swam together. Every sentence ended with something like worry or fear or guilt. I wondered if anyone would ever write joy in those boxes again. By noon, I couldn't stand being home. I drove to Avery Wellness, the therapy center I'd opened 2 years earlier. The sign out front still gleamed new, my name embossed under the logo. It should have felt like pride. Instead, it felt like a mask. Inside, the waiting room smelled of lavender and sanitizer. My assistant looked up from her desk, eyes cautious. "Morning, Dr. Avery. Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "Just catching up on paperwork." The lie tasted like cold metal. At 1 o'clock, we had our weekly staff meeting. 6 therapists gathered around the oval table. I sat near the end, trying to fade into the background. Tom Weaver, a senior counselor with a permanent smirk, was presenting data on client retention. He liked numbers because they didn't cry. When he finished, the director asked for feedback. Tom leaned back in his chair, his gaze landing on me. "I heard you've been taking a lighter caseload lately, Liana." "Everything all right? Just pacing myself," I said. He smiled, thin and knowing. "Therapists should manage their own emotions first, right?" A few people laughed under their breath, the kind of polite laughter that slices deeper than outright cruelty. I felt heat rise in my neck, but I kept my expression steady. I excused myself halfway through the meeting, mumbling something about a call. In the parking lot, I climbed into my car, shut the door, and finally let it happen. The tears came without drama, no sobs, just quiet leaking. The steering wheel blurred. My chest ached from holding it all in. I thought of Tom's smirk, of Ethan's calm voice, of how easily men confused composure with strength. For years, I'd made silence look graceful. It wasn't. It was suffocation dressed in good manners. A knock startled me. My phone screen lit up with an old name. Valerie Kim. I hadn't seen her in over a year. She'd been my mentor at UCLA when I was an adjunct there, the kind of woman who walked into a room and steadied it. "Hey, kid," she said when I answered. "You sound awful." I laughed, wiping at my face. "Thanks for the pep talk. I'm in town for a conference," she said. "Coffee now?" An hour later, I met her at a cafe on Pine Street. She looked the same as always. Short gray hair, lipstick that meant business eyes that saw through polite lies. You lost weight, she said, studying me. That usually means something's wrong. You could say that. Ethan's gone. She stirred her espresso. I'm surprised it took this long. I frowned. Don't give me that look, Layana. You used to tell me about him. Everything about that man screamed control with good grammar. I sighed. He said I was too much to love. Valerie chuckled softly. Ah, yes, the classic diagnosis. Woman expresses feelings, man mistakes it for intensity disorder. I smiled for the first time in days. She leaned forward. You know what your problem is? You confuse understanding with fixing. You think if you can explain your feelings perfectly, someone will finally hold them gently. But the wrong person will always see them as noise. I stared at the swirl of foam in my coffee. So what do I do with all that noise now? You document it, she said. Talk into a recorder every night. Don't censor it. Don't make it therapeutic. Just feel it. I hesitated. Like journaling. More like exercising, she said, smiling. You always did have a gift for turning storms into words. Maybe it's time you use it on yourself. When we stood to leave, she hugged me. Her coat smelled like mint tea and familiarity. She pulled back and tapped my chest lightly. Feeling deeply isn't a flaw, Liana. It's your compass. Stop treating it like a broken part. That night back in my apartment, I looked at the empty couch where Ethan used to read financial reports while pretending to listen to me. I set my phone on the counter and opened the recording app. My voice sounded strange at first, too steady, too professional, like I was dictating case notes. This is Liana Avery, I said, then laughed. God, no. Restart. I hit record again. Today was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't heal, just echoes. I think I've been afraid of hearing myself. Maybe that's why I filled every silence with other people's stories. I paused, hearing the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft traffic outside. I thought of Maya sitting on my couch, whispering that she was too emotional to be loved. I whispered back to my phone. I get it. I really do. When I stopped recording, I saved the file without thinking and named it the Storm Diaries. I hesitated before adding one more word, entry 0. I plugged in my phone to charge and walked to the window. Snow had started to fall, thin flakes that vanished before they touched the glass. Across the street, a bar's neon sign flickered between open and closed like it couldn't decide. The world was moving again, and I was still catching my breath. I turned off the lamp, letting the dim city light spill through the blinds. For the first time in months, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It wasn't his kind of quiet anymore. It was mine, raw and honest, waiting to be filled with something real. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you, Chapter 3, When I Stopped Shrinking. By spring, the quiet had turned into space. I filled it first with small things, early runs along the lake path, real breakfasts instead of coffee and a protein bar, 10 minutes every night talking into my phone. Some nights I spoke about patience in abstract ways, removing identifying details until they sounded like parables. Some nights I spoke about my mother and the way she used to hum in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. Slowly, my voice lost the careful tone I used with clients and found edges that belonged to me. In June, I flew to San Francisco for a conference on trauma and practice. The hotel ballroom was cold enough to keep everyone awake. I wore a simple navy dress and the kind of calm I did not have to perform. My panel was scheduled after lunch. The moderator introduced me by reading an old bio that still called me an adjunct. I let it pass. I stepped to the podium and looked at a sea of faces, mostly women in dark blazers, a few men checking their phones. I began with a story I had told versions of for years, not the heartbreak, the pattern that lives under it. I spoke about the way girls learn to narrate their feelings like weather reports so no one gets caught in the rain. I said the title out loud and felt the room lean in. Why women are told to feel less. I talked about how less is usually code for quieter, easier, smaller. I traced the tiny permissions we give ourselves. A laugh instead of a boundary. A nod instead of a no. I did not mention Ethan. I did not need to. Every woman in the room knew his first name by a different face. During questions, a younger clinician stood and asked if there was a responsible way to share personal experience without crossing ethical lines. I answered like the teacher I used to be. Use composites. Secure consent when anyone is identifiable. Keep the focus on process, not gossip. Disclose only what serves the client or the audience, and then take yourself out of the center. When the session ended, a small crowd gathered. Business cards appeared. An editor asked if I had considered a book. Another woman said she felt like I had read her diary. I smiled and said the thing I always say. We have the same diary. We were just told to write in smaller letters. On the flight home, I listened to my recordings. My voice had changed. Less clinical, more rooted. I heard it and thought maybe this is the thing. Not a book. Not yet. Something more immediate. I opened a note and typed an outline. A series on emotional integrity that sounded like a personal letter but followed the same guardrails I teach. No names, no cases without consent. Clear disclaimer at the top of every episode that it is educational and not therapy. I texted Amelia Reed, a producer I knew from a community mental health project. She was the kind of woman who makes things move without announcing it. She called within the hour. Liana, your timing is spooky. I just wrapped a season and have an open slot. What are you thinking? A podcast recorded at my office, 10 to 15 minutes each, simple production. I want to speak like I do at the end of a session when the air is thinner and true. Title: The Storm Diaries. She laughed softly. You finally let yourself be the weather. I can get you a portable setup and a sound engineer for the first week. We keep it lean. You own the feed. I want you to keep your rights. I need a legal page and a voice disclaimer. No clinical advice. Confidentiality strict. Done. We open every episode with a disclaimer, and you do your anonymous composites like we discussed. No HIPAA landmines. We launched in October on a dreary Monday that felt like it needed company. The first episode was called The Day I Called Feelings Data. I recorded in one take at my desk, a plant leaning into the frame like a friend. When I finished, the engineer smiled and pressed stop. Amelia sent me a screenshot that night of the podcast charting in a small mental health category. Not viral, not nothing. By week 3, emails began to arrive. A woman from Ohio who had stayed quiet through an entire marriage. A teacher in Arizona who realized she was modeling self-erasure for her students. Then a name I recognized appeared in my inbox. Maya. She had graduated, moved across town, and found a tiny studio with pale yellow walls. She wrote that the episode about replacing apology with boundaries made her pack her boxes. She said she felt ridiculous for waiting for a stranger's voice to give her permission. I wrote back that sometimes a stranger is easier to believe because they do not benefit from your silence. I told her I was proud of her in the ordinary way, the way pride feels like a chair pulled out for you at a table you thought was full. By winter, the show had a rhythm. Mondays were for recording. Wednesdays were for answering 3 listener emails on air, scrubbed free of identifiers, boiled down to the questions underneath the questions. Why does love feel safest when I am smallest? How do I tell the truth without setting my life on fire? Amelia kept the schedule human. She would text me a picture of a latte and type 3 words, "Drink this now." I did. One afternoon in February, I opened my inbox and saw Ethan's name. I stared at it for a long minute. The subject line was polite and familiar, the way a realtor might write you after you moved out. I clicked. Liana, I listened to your talk from San Francisco and a few episodes of your podcast. I'm proud you are using your emotions well now. You always had potential. It is good to see you channeling it productively. I read it twice. Each sentence sounded like a pat on the head from a man who hates dogs. I let the anger roll through me and pass like weather I did not have to hold. Then I replied with one line. You never knew what my emotions could build. I hit send and felt something unclench. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, just clarity. Later that night, I told Amelia. She blinked. He really wrote that, every word placed with tweezers. What a gift. Now you never have to wonder if it was you. It never was. It was always what I represented. Noise he could not mute. In March, I was finishing up an episode when Amelia waved from the doorway and whispered that someone had emailed asking for a meeting. She handed me her laptop. The subject line said Documentary Collaboration Inquiry. The name under it made me sit up. Julian Hart. I knew his work. He made films that felt like quiet rooms where hard truths learned how to breathe. We set a time to meet at a tiny cafe in Capitol Hill with wobbly tables and a cat who believed it owned the place. I arrived early and ordered tea. When Julian walked in, he looked approachable rather than famous. Dark sweater, camera bag, the kind of face that listens well. He spotted me and smiled without overperforming it. Liana, thank you for making time, he said. I would have found it, I answered. Your last film saved me 3 arguments. That is the nicest review I have ever heard. We sat near the window. He did not start with a pitch. He asked about my show. Then he asked about my listeners, where they are writing from, what they are hungry for. He kept his hands wrapped around his mug, like he was trying to warm something that was not coffee. I am developing a film on women who were told they were too much, he said finally. Not as spectacle, as map. The working title is Women Who Feel Too Much. I want a clinical voice in the room to keep us honest. I do not want to exploit pain. I want to trace what happens when someone stops shrinking. I took a breath. If I do this, there are lines. No current clients. No case details without clear consent. Anyone who participates signs a release with full understanding. We protect anonymity unless they want to be seen. He nodded. I already budgeted for a legal consultant and a trauma-informed advisor. I am asking you to help shape the questions and to appear as yourself when it makes sense. Only if you want to. The cat chose that moment to leap onto our table and stare at me like a judge. Julian gently lifted it and set it on a chair. He did not make it cute. He just handled the situation and returned to the conversation. Something inside me relaxed. Why this film, I asked. For you. He looked out the window for a beat. My wife died 3 years ago. Depression. Everyone told me to move on quietly. I hated how the softness in our house got turned into a problem to solve. Making space for feelings feels like a memorial and a revolt. We did not talk for a moment. The cafe sound filled the pause, milk steaming, someone laughing too hard at a story. I realized I had not been this still with a man in years. I can help you do this without harming people, I said, and I can refuse to answer questions that betray the work. I will thank you for refusing if it keeps us right, he said. Will you think about it? I already did. We spent an hour sketching possibilities with words. Interviews with women at different life stages. A section where we dismantle the myth that therapy is stoicism with a license. A scene about the difference between privacy and secrecy. No dramatic confrontations, no ambushes, proof instead of rage. Before we left, Julian pulled a small notebook from his bag. I wrote this down the first time I heard your show, he said. He turned the notebook so I could read it. Women aren't too emotional. They are too aware for shallow men. He met my eyes. This lives under everything we are trying to say. It is not anti-men, I said. It is anti-shallow, he answered. We agreed to start with a pilot interview to test tone. He would send a draft of the release forms for my review. Amelia would consult on audio. I left the cafe with a warm ache that felt like progress. On the sidewalk, a gust of wind lifted my hair. For once, I did not smooth it back down. 2 days later, an email arrived from Maya. Her subject line said, "You told the truth and I believed you." She wrote about applying to a postgraduate program in counseling. She wanted to study trauma recovery. She said she planned to change her last name after graduation to mark the life she chose. I read it twice, then called Amelia. Put her on the list, I said. Future episode. She chooses her name, her details, everything. We keep it clean. Of course, Amelia said. I will draft an outline and a consent checklist. She gets to veto anything that feels unsafe. At night, I returned to my recordings. I noticed a new quality in my voice. Not louder, wider. The episodes began to land differently. Men wrote 2 soft messages about wanting to be better partners. A man from Minnesota said he had played one of my episodes in the car with his daughter and realized he had been teaching her to apologize for having a heartbeat. I wrote back to him with resources for fathers and asked him to keep going. Spring opened in Seattle in its modest way. Cherry trees did their brief and perfect thing. I walked to work with coffee and did not mistake the weather for a sign. On a Tuesday morning, Julian sent a link to a private folder with a short test reel. It was just a montage of hands and rooms and city noise. At the end, there was a title card sitting quietly on the screen, Women Who Feel Too Much. I watched it twice and then sent back notes. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji that made me laugh. He was not trying to be serious all the time. He was trying to be accurate. One afternoon, I sat in my office after a session and caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was not smaller than before. She was the size she had always been, just standing up straight. My phone buzzed, a text from Amelia with a chart showing our show sitting in a higher bracket. I smiled and typed back that charts matter less than letters. She sent back a picture of a stack of letters. We were both right. Later that week, I walked past the restaurant where Ethan and I had eaten our last dinner. Through the glass, I saw a couple leaning toward each other, hands earnest on the table. I felt the old ache flare and then evaporate like a match used to light a candle that was already burning. I kept walking. The city did not cheer. It did not need to. That night, I recorded a new entry without notes. I spoke about how the body keeps score even when the mind pretends to forget. I spoke about learning to measure progress by the softness you can allow yourself on an ordinary Tuesday. When I finished, I did not cry or celebrate. I just saved the file and sat in the quiet, the good kind, the kind that holds rather than hushes. Outside, a siren faded into distance. Somewhere, a train crossed a bridge and made that low sound I have loved since childhood. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window until my eyes adjusted to the dark. In the glass, I could see my outline like a horizon. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not by the world, by myself. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 4, The Calm I Created. Filming started on a gray morning that smelled like rain and coffee. The crew from Heartline Productions filled my small office with cables, cameras, and the hum of people who knew how to build stories out of silence. Julian stood near the window talking quietly with the cinematographer about light angles. He glanced at me and smiled a calm nod that meant we were ready. Maya was our first interview. She arrived early, her hair shorter than before, her eyes steadier. I greeted her at the door and she handed me a folded paper. "It's the consent form," she said. "I read every line. You were right. It feels better when you choose to tell it." I smiled. "Thank you for trusting us again." She laughed nervously. "It's different now. I'm not the girl sitting on your couch crying about someone else's approval. I want people to see what healing looks like when it's not perfect." During the interview, she spoke carefully but without shame. Julian kept the frame tight on her hands, the way they twisted and opened as she talked about fear. I watched from off camera, my throat tight. When we wrapped, she stood and hugged me, whispering, "You helped me find my voice. I hope this helps someone else find theirs." The next few months moved in scenes. Interviews in Portland, Los Angeles, back to Seattle. Women of all ages sat under soft lights and spoke about the quiet violence of being told they felt too much. We recorded in living rooms, libraries, and once inside a yoga studio that smelled like eucalyptus and bravery. At the end of each day, Julian and I would debrief over dinner, surrounded by gear cases and notes. He asked questions that weren't about production. He wanted to know how it felt to witness so many echoes of myself. I told him the truth. It was exhausting and holy all at once. When we finished filming, the editing room became our second home. Julian's team worked through hours of footage while I reviewed transcripts for accuracy and consent. Every release form was double-checked, every name either approved or blurred. The lawyer hired to monitor compliance sat with me more than once to ensure HIPAA standards were intact. It felt like threading a needle through a hurricane, but we did it. The trailer dropped in early summer, a 2-minute sequence of voices overlapping, laughter turning into tears, and at the center my own face saying quietly, "Peace isn't silence. It's safety to speak." Within days, it spread online. Journalists called it raw and necessary. Some called it indulgent. My inbox filled again, but this time the messages were public. Podcasts invited me to talk about vulnerability, morning shows asked for appearances. I declined most of them. I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted the message to live on its own. Then came the backlash. A conservative media group posted an op-ed calling the film a danger to emotional stability. They said it glorified victimhood and encouraged oversharing. Their headline read, "When Therapy Turns into Theater." I laughed at first. Then the studio called. A conference room full of executives waited on the screen. Their faces polished their smiles, cautious. The head of distribution cleared her throat. "Liana, the trailer is strong, but there's concern about tone," she said. "We think trimming some of the heavier therapy scenes would broaden appeal. Maybe ease up on the emotional parts, keep it more inspirational." Julian's image flickered into view beside mine. He stayed silent, letting me speak. "You mean, make it easier to watch?" I asked. "Exactly," she said. Sometimes less intensity draws a wider audience. I felt my jaw tighten. Less intensity is what got us here. If we cut truth for comfort, we're lying. One of the lawyers tried to mediate. We're only suggesting a few edits for pacing. I opened a file on my desk and held it up to the camera. This is the research data behind every scene you want to cut. Peer-reviewed studies, longitudinal outcomes, verified consent. This isn't sensationalism, it's documentation. You can't ask for authenticity and then mute it when it becomes inconvenient. The lawyer looked at Julian as if to find backup. He leaned forward. Heartline Productions stands by the material. We hired Dr. Avery for integrity, not decoration. The footage stays. The call ended awkwardly. I turned to Julian. You didn't have to back me up like that. He smiled. I didn't back you up. I followed the evidence. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside the building. The air was crisp, and downtown Seattle looked washed clean by light rain. For the first time since the trailer release, I felt something close to relief. A week later, the film's official social media posted the trailer again with a quote from me. The line, "Peace isn't silence, it's safety to speak." People started using it in captions on signs at small rallies for mental health awareness. I was proud until one afternoon Amelia texted me a screenshot. Did you see this? It was a comment under the trailer. Ethan Cole. His profile photo still the same professional headshot from years ago. The comment read, "Glad you finally found peace." Thousands of people liked it, assuming it was supportive. My chest went cold. I could almost hear the smirk behind his words, the same calm tone that once dismissed my feelings as storms. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. Some things expose themselves better untouched. 2 days later, irony did its work. Ethan's startup launched a new campaign using the slogan, "Find peace, not drama." The internet noticed. Someone paired his ad with a clip from my film. The caption read, "The same words can heal or manipulate depending on whose mouth they come from." The backlash was swift. His company issued an apology about the unfortunate overlap of language. I never commented. I didn't need to. In August, we premiered the full documentary at a small festival in Los Angeles. The theater was modest, but the applause felt enormous. Afterward, a woman in her 50s came up to me crying softly. "My daughter watched your trailer and decided to stay in therapy," she said. "She thought she was weak. Now she thinks she's brave." Julian overheard and touched my arm lightly. "That's why we made it," he whispered. A week later, back in Seattle, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter in neat cursive. Maya. Dear Liana, I got in. I was accepted into the Trauma Recovery Graduate Program at the University of Washington. I kept your phrase taped to my mirror all year. Feelings are not flaws. I want to teach others that too. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like when it whispers instead of shouts. I sat at my desk for a long time before folding the letter back into its envelope. The city outside buzzed with traffic, but all I could hear was the soft certainty in her words, the kind of peace that isn't borrowed or begged for. Later that night, Julian stopped by to drop off the final cut on a flash drive. He handed it to me, smiling tiredly. "We made it through the storm," he said. I nodded. "And we didn't let anyone edit the rain out of it." He laughed quietly. "That should be the tagline." After he left, I opened my journal and wrote one simple line. I didn't lose love. I found truth. I set down the pen, looked around my apartment, and realized it no longer felt like a museum of someone else's life. It was simply mine, filled with work and light and silence that no longer punished. I sat by the window watching the reflection of the city ripple on Lake Union, feeling a calm that came not from absence, but from belonging to myself. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 5. Storm and Sunlight. Both New York held its breath like it knew what was coming. The theater lights dimmed, the screen went black, and for a second all I could hear was the soft intake of air from hundreds of strangers who had just watched the private lives of women become a public mirror. Applause rose from the center and rolled outward like a tide. It filled the room and then kept going as if the building itself needed to clap. I turned to Julian and saw what I had seen all year in him, not triumph, but respect. He put a palm over his heart for a beat, and I nodded back. We had made the film we promised to make. People stood and kept clapping. I felt the peculiar stillness that sometimes follows impact, the kind you get when the plane lands and you are suddenly aware of every muscle you were holding. The house lights came up and faces became faces again. A woman in the front row lifted both hands in the air like she was blessing an altar. I knew she was blessing herself. As the crowd began to move, I spotted him for a fraction of a second, near the aisle, taller than I remembered, head bent toward the floor. Ethan. He was with a woman I did not know, her hand on his sleeve as if she were guiding him out of a church service that had gone on too long. He did not look at me. He did not need to. I watched the back of his neck pale and certain, slipping into the current of people, and felt nothing like rage. The feeling was much simpler. Relief. I smiled at no one and turned back toward the stage. The moderator invited us up for a brief Q&A. The room quieted, the kind of quiet that made my line about safety feel large enough to sit in. Questions came about craft and consent and how to hold a camera on someone's trembling hands without making it a spectacle. Julian talked about angles and light and how we kept lighting low when a participant's voice went high. I talked about the legal scaffolding that made the film possible, about release forms that were explained and re-explained, about the difference between privacy and secrecy and how one protects and the other corrodes. Rebecca Hale from a national outlet stood and asked the question that would become a headline 2 hours later. She wanted to know what my biggest revenge was. She said it gently, like a doctor asking about pain where the bone had healed. I told her the truth, living deeply without apology. The room made a sound that was almost a sigh and almost a roar. I do not chase quotes, but that one chased me anyway. After the Q&A, we stepped into the lobby where cameras and microphones waited with bright smiles. Contracts had been signed weeks ago to manage what could be used and how, and our publicist handed laminated cards to each outlet that spelled out boundaries. No current clients referenced, no scenes described beyond those in the public cut. The guardrails let me be human without becoming careless. I answered questions about process and about the odd freedom that comes with choosing your own narrative. When a producer tried to coax me into naming a specific person who inspired the line about peace, I smiled and told her the line was older than any relationship I had, older than any man, possibly older than my name. On the sidewalk, air moved like velvet. A cluster of women in their 20s huddled together near a poster for the film. One of them touched the title with 2 fingers as if it might disappear if she did not hold it in place. The city glowed like it had just learned a new word. The next morning, my inbox was a living thing. Journalists, clinicians, a dancer from Miami who wrote a paragraph about feeling safer in her own ribcage. An email from a foundation's director asking if I would consult on a series of workshops for young women who were entering high-visibility spaces. A straightforward note from our entertainment attorney confirming that distribution had finalized the ancillary rights. The subject lines were a chorus: saw it, needed it, thank you, please come speak. I flew home to Seattle that week, body tired, mind steady. When I opened the door to my apartment, the first thing I noticed was that it no longer felt like an exhibit of survival. It felt like a studio. Amelia had been there earlier to finish setting up the new microphones, and she left me a note shaped like a long breath. Your room sounds like a person. She had framed a simple line and hung it above the desk. He said I was too much. Turns out I was just right for myself. I read it and felt something inside me seat itself in a chair and lean back. We recorded a debrief episode about what it means to be seen and not consumed. I spoke about the premiere without naming it, and about the strange kindness of not having to explain yourself to every question. Amelia asked me to describe what safety sounded like on tape. I said it sounded like silence that did not punish. When we finished, we listened back to the opening 30 seconds and looked at each other without speaking. It was enough. A week later, I invited Maya to the studio for a conversation that would air at the end of the month. She walked in with a backpack and a calm I recognized as earned. She was now a trainee at a local counseling clinic, sharp with boundaries and soft where it mattered. We did not use quotes on air because we did not need to. We spoke to each other like people who had walked through the same storm and learned how to carry umbrellas without apology. She told me that when she sits with a client now, she imagines their younger self pulling up a chair and she asks both of them what they need. I told her that is the whole job. We kept it within the ethics we promised. No old session details, no easy victories. Just two women talking about work that keeps working on you. Julian texted me later that day with a photo of a whiteboard in his office. On it were two words in thick marker, next series. Underneath, he had written the working title, Depth is Not Dangerous. He wanted to follow teachers and nurses and men who were trying not to go numb. He asked if I would produce a segment on fathers and daughters learning to name moods without shame. I said yes before the period in his sentence had time to settle. The twist came on a Tuesday morning when Amelia burst into my office with her laptop open and her hair pretending to be calm. The podcast charts had updated and the Storm Diaries had climbed into the top 10 across the country. It made no sense in the way those things often make no sense. We had not changed format or tried to be louder. We had just kept our promise to talk like people at a kitchen table. The emails that followed were not about numbers. They were about doors. A deputy director at the Department of Education requested a call. A task force was building a pilot program for emotional literacy in public schools, and they wanted someone who could thread science and story without preaching. Would I advise on curriculum? Would I help write language that made feelings sound like skills rather than enemies? On the call, I heard the steady voice of a woman who had taught high school for 20 years and now wrote policy. She wanted vocabulary lists that children could actually remember. She wanted a short exercise for the start of every day that did not feel like a performance. She wanted teachers to have a script that gave them permission to be human in front of kids. I told her I could help with all of that. We talked about consent and confidentiality and what a classroom can hold and what it cannot. We talked about how to account for culture and for families who do not know how to speak this language yet. When the call ended, I stared at the ceiling and felt a quiet that tasted like work. News coverage had its own rhythm. A headline paired my face with the line about revenge, and for a day I thought my phone might fall into the lake from exhaustion. The attention did not feel dangerous, but it felt like something that needed to be shepherded. The publicist set limits on how many interviews I could give in a week. We turned down a reality show offer. We said yes to a public radio series on grief. In the background, karma did its particular tidy work without a memo from me. Ethan's panel appearance at a business conference was quietly canceled after organizers received too many complaints about his campaign language. A small statement appeared on the event site about evolving alignments with values. I found out because someone sent me the link with a note that simply said the universe keeps receipts. I did not reply. I did not celebrate. Consequences can be their own form of closure. Summer in Seattle feels like a reward for patience. On a rare clear evening, I met Julian at Gasworks Park with takeout and a blanket. We watched the city push its lights up through the blue and talked about shots we wished we had and shots we were grateful we did not get. He told me that working on the film had made him less afraid of sad rooms. I told him it made me less afraid of my own. We did not put a name on anything because names are heavy and sometimes presence is enough. Autumn came, and with it a postcard from a school in Oregon where a pilot classroom had tried our draft exercise for 3 weeks. The teacher wrote that her students had started referring to their morning check-in as brushing their emotional teeth. She said no one cried less, but fewer kids apologized for crying. I taped the card to my wall next to the framed line Amelia had given me. The invitation for a second screening tour arrived in October. New cities, small theaters, conversations that ran longer than the film. At each stop, someone would stand near the back and speak without a microphone. They would say, they used to be loud in ways that were not honest and quiet in ways that were. They would say something shifted. They would thank me and the team in a voice that thanked themselves too. On the last night of the tour back in Seattle, I came home to a sky washed clean by rain. I set my bag down and opened the balcony door. The air held that sharp aftertone that makes everything taste new. Lake Union wore the city like a reflection it had earned. I stepped outside and let the damp settle on my skin. I thought about the first night of silence after Ethan left and how it had felt like being punished by a judge who would not look up. This was not that. This was the kind of quiet that allows music to begin. I went inside and turned on the small lamp on my desk. The room glowed like a throat cleared. I sat down and opened a fresh document, not for a client, not for an episode just for me. I wrote 2 lines without stopping. The best revenge is existing freely. The rest is weather. My breath came easier after I read it back. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair that had shaped itself to my spine over years of work. On the balcony again, the city was a soft riot of lights. Somewhere below, a couple laughed in the unembarrassed way new love laughs. A ferry pushed a line of white across the dark water. I let the last words of the year form in my head without forcing them to be perfect. He wanted calm. I became storm and sunlight both. If you have ever been told you are too much, consider this a hand held out on a rainy sidewalk. Do not shrink. Stay with me here and tell me what part of your voice you are ready to turn back on. Tell me the sentence you were taught to swallow so we can rewrite it into something that belongs to you. The world does not need you smaller. It needs your full volume.